Hello and welcome to Truss Issues, the podcast where we're tracking the first 100 days of Liz Truss's premiership, seeing how she gets on, seeing her successes, her failures, and whether she's able to meet the objectives and the priorities that she set before she took office. Today I'm joined by Ben Blissett, TLDR UK's lead writer.
Hello.
And later in the show we'll be joined by Zach Michaelis, TLDR's editor-in-chief. As you probably noticed, we're recording this remotely today. This is actually the second time we've recorded this podcast. We first recorded it last Thursday, but we had technical issues. So I lied on the floor, I screamed, and then we gave up. So
it's not gone too well.
Well, now we're doing it remotely, which is maybe worse. But there's not much we can do. I continue to be ill. Made worse by the fact I ran the London Marathon yesterday, which means I also can't walk as well as being ill, and the illness has got worse. So really, it's a lose-lose. So I can't be in the office today. That's what I'm trying to tell you there. That's why we're doing this terrible remote situation.
It hopefully will only be a one-off, but it's better than doing nothing. It's still,
which is what we did
happening
on Thursday when we couldn't record.
Yes, this is true. This is true.
Okay, so the way we started this last time, and the way we probably want to start it again when we're actually re-recording for people to listen, is running through Liz Truss's promises that she made and how well she's managed to deliver on those. These are promises which aren't necessarily set in stone. They're not things that she's written down as 9 core promises. But these are 9 things that we pulled from her speeches, from her kind of core pitch for herself during the race for leadership. And these are the things that we're tracking throughout this first 100 days. So if we want to run through these, we're kind of a month in now. We've seen all kinds of things no one would have expected. Let's see how she's doing on these. The first one that's really worth talking about, mainly because it's pretty prescient at the moment, is she promised to cut taxes on day one. How's that one going, Ben?
Yeah, so I think... So as we're recording this, Liz Truss has actually U-turned on one of the biggest tax cuts that she'd promised. When I say biggest, I mean sort of most spoken about. So that is the she'd planned to scrap the 45% tax threshold. She's not going to be doing that now, basically because there's been backlash from the Conservative Party. I don't want to talk about this too much now because, as you said earlier, we're getting Zach on. I'm sure we'll talk about this later. So I'm just sort of going to put that to one side for now and talk about some of the other tax cuts that she'd done. So obviously, when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, he'd planned to increase national insurance, which she's cancelled, and she's reduced the threshold for income tax, the basic level of income tax, from 20% to 19%, which is still going ahead. So she has cut taxes.
And corporation tax too.
Yes, and corporation tax from, was it 19% to 25%? It's not going to go up, so it's going to remain at 19%.
She's scrapping the original increase.
Exactly. Obviously, there was a stipulation that this would be done on day one, which... I mean, I'll give her the benefit of the doubt of saying that she probably would have done that on day one had our monarch not died and we were in a mourning period. So she was constrained by events that meant that she couldn't do tax cuts as quickly as she wanted. But by and large, her commitment to cutting taxes still happened. I would argue that she went further than most people, even her own backers, expected. So, the other week we spoke to Kevin Hollinrake, who is a Northern Conservative MP for Thirsk and Moulton, and he said that, he was surprised by how far she went with her tax cuts, which I think is a fair assessment of some backbench Tory MPs. She just to actually evaluate her on this, I would say she has met that commitment to cut taxes, albeit not on day one, but as soon as she feasibly could, given the death of the Queen.
And even though she's rolled it back, as you say, she went further than was expected in the first place. So even though she's rolled back some of that, it's still more than many would have expected. So I think that's a tick there. I think that's if you support Truss and you want her to do what she said she was going to do, that's a good start. What about energy bills? Liz Truss promised during the campaign that she would immediately act on energy bills and the kind of cost of living crisis. Has she been able to do that yet?
Yeah, she has. Even before the death of the Queen, she had announced that she'd be limiting the She'd be limited the sort of the energy price cap, which is was expected to go up to nearly £6,000 a year. So she's limiting that at £2,500. Now, it is worth pointing out that with the energy price cap, that is actually linked to average usage. So for an average household using an average amount of electricity and gas, they would expect to pay, now with the new energy price cap of £2,500, they'd expect to pay £2,500. If they were to have a higher than average usage, they would pay more than £2,500. The cap isn't actually a cap. It's not a maximum amount that you can pay. It's a maximum amount that energy providers can provide on the amount that you use, so kilowatt hours, etc. Now, there was a bit of a confusing communication about this from the Prime Minister, who seemed on some radio interviews last week to indicate that families won't pay a penny more than £2,500, which just isn't true. And this led to independent organisations such as Full Fact to call on the Prime Minister to actually clarify this position, because that's a really dangerous and misleading thing to tell families who are trying to prepare for winter. When energy usage does go up. And are trying to figure out household budgets, which are already squeezed by the cost of living crisis, to tell them that they won't pay a penny more than £2,500. That might reassure people incorrectly that, well, that's the maximum. It's also worth pointing out that at the beginning of this year, the energy price cap was £1,271, I think. So, significantly less than £2,500 that it is now going to be. The other thing worth noting as well is that this isn't going to be funded through a windfall tax, as some countries on the continent are doing. It's going to be funded by borrowing. Specifically, the government has said that they expect that the borrowing will be about £60 billion over the next 6 months. Wow. Just to put that in perspective, the NHS test and trace over the pandemic cost about £37 billion. And there was huge scandal with that about how that would be paid for. Obviously, a lot of policies about, and Liz Truss's argument on that was that we'd pay that over the longer term because it's a once in a generation event. But obviously, an extra £60 billion on top of that is, it's a lot of borrowing from the UK's perspective. So, this she has limited energy bills, but that is through a lot of borrowing, which some people will take issue with. But on the promise that she would limit energy bills, she has done that. So if we're evaluating her again, that is a tick. She has limited energy bills.
Yeah, not necessarily as much as some people would have wanted, and not in the ways that some people have wanted. But for the specific promise, she has acted basically immediately to limit energy bills. Yes, another tick there. Another promise was to tackle strike action within 30 days. We're at about 30 days now. We have more strikes coming up this Wednesday and Saturday. How would you say that one's going?
Well, as you said, the strikes are still happening on Wednesday and Saturday. So I think that kind of answers the question. For I haven't heard any movement on this really. She seems to be massively focused on this mini budget, and obviously it's the Conservative Party conference at the minute. But by and large, no movement. I don't think she's done this. I don't think she's met this condition. She promised this, and I don't think she did it. Okay,
next one then is resolving Northern Ireland, which sounds like a big challenge. How's that one going?
Yeah, well, again, nothing. I've heard nothing on this. There's been no bills gone through Parliament. There's been no big announcements, I don't think she's done anything with Northern Ireland yet. Potentially this is because it's not as much of an issue at the minute. There are often flare-ups there with some obviously trade issues and some back and forward with Europe about how the Brexit arrangements are going to work. But there hasn't really been many flare-ups with that yet. So perhaps that's why. But irrespective of why, no, she hasn't resolved Northern Ireland, which is a big claim, to be honest. But she hasn't really made any movement in that direction yet at all.
A fairly nebulous claim too. Resolve Northern Ireland. It's quite hard to clarify. But I mean, as you say, the only really notable thing that's even happened was yesterday when Steve Baker apologised for his behaviour towards Ireland during Brexit talks. But that's obviously fairly unrelated from the Truss administration. But it's an interesting development in the relations between the UK and Ireland, which have been strained lately.
Yeah, absolutely.
Next promise then was to support Ukraine. Obviously the crisis continues to go on. We've got a bunch of videos on TLDR EU about it. We've been talking about it a lot lately. Some big developments. Is any of that anything to do with Truss's commitment to Ukraine and the support they're receiving from the UK?
Yeah, so it's a bit difficult here. Obviously, the Johnson administration had committed a lot of money and, to an extent, weapons to Ukraine, which are inevitably still obviously being used there. But in terms of additional support given by Truss, there hasn't been any huge support packages. Obviously, we've seen some from the US recently, but there's not really been any from the UK. Something that is notable on this is just the fact that Liz Truss last week, after her car crash radio interviews that she did, so she did sort of 5 minute, I think 8 5-minute interviews with local radio presenters last week, and the reaction is basically that she was absolutely savaged. We might get on to talk about this a bit more later, but she was absolutely savaged on there. In response to that, she sort of followed the tried and tested Johnsonian doctrine of calling Zelensky and reaffirming her support to him and to the people of Ukraine. Largely, I think that probably worked more in the favour of Truss as to sort of like a diversionary tactic to try and get people away from talking about her radio interviews. But basically, she was saying that after the sham referendums held in Ukraine last week by Russia to try and sort of promote the idea that their captured territory in the east and the south was now Russian, and that any attacks would be considered an attack on Russia. She was basically just saying that the UK will not perceive those as Russian, which is basically in line with the rest of Europe, the West, and a lot of just sort of the world, really. So yeah, she has sort of reaffirmed her commitment, but in terms of there's been no additional support packages, and it's dubious. The timing of that call seems very much for the same reason that Johnson used to call Zelensky at times, to try and sort of divert attention. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that Johnson's support for Ukraine wasn't legitimate, but there were certainly times when his calls were cleverly timed whenever there was a scandal. So it's interesting that the call to Zelensky went out on the same day that she was receiving huge flack from her her 8 successive car crash interviews. So aside from that, no, not a huge amount of movement, but there was some sort of verbal support. So I suppose you can give her credit for that.
Okay, so there's some support for Ukraine and some support for her own administration via support for Ukraine. Next then, getting inflation under control. This is obviously already an issue over the summer, or an issue that we saw on the horizon. Is that something that's been tackled at all yet, or has no action been taken when it comes to inflation?
Well, action's been taken. So the mini budget, obviously being said action, and there's been a number of measures, but I haven't seen any updated inflation figures, so it's sort of hard to guess. But inflation was still running high. It's one of those ones where it's going to take a little bit of time to actually see how much of an impact her mini budget had. Some will argue that it's going to make it worse, some will argue that it's going to ease it. It's a bit difficult to tell. But she has taken action. Whether her action helps that is sort of yet to be seen. Okay,
we'll wait to judge that one then. Ensuring people have better access to doctors. That was one of her core policies when it comes to the NHS. How's that one shaping up?
Again, no movement. It's still early days. This podcast is doing her first 100 days. It's still only a few weeks in. But no, I haven't seen any movement on that. She hasn't. There aren't any bills going through the Commons yet on that. She's not really, or at least not in the late stages. So it doesn't look like they're going to be in any time soon. Boris Johnson's plan with the increase in national insurance was to pay for social care to start with, and then the NHS. And I presume that her, the spending on the NHS, some of that would go towards, helping people have better access to doctors. Now, Liz Truss has revoked the increase in national insurance, but has said that she will commit the same money to be accessible to social care and then the NHS. So, there is an argument to be made that because she's continuing with that, perhaps in the future people will have better access to doctors. But outside of that, not a huge amount. And obviously that is going to be, that's going to be a long-term project. So that's not anything that we're going to see anytime soon. So again, a bit mixed, but I'd say very weakly there's something being done there, but it's very small.
More a continuation of previous action rather than a discrete new policy. And even as you say, that old policy is still having its funding changed from the taxes-based model to more borrowing, which I'm sure some would take issue with. Penultimate one here is to unite the Conservative Party. And as you might be able to tell from the tone of my voice, I think I already know how this one's going, but is the Conservative Party united, Ben?
Yeah, your sarcastic tone there is entirely correct. No, she has not united the Conservative Party. As we said on the last podcast and the podcast before that, and I'm sure we'll say in a number of podcasts from here on out, she represents a very ideological right wing of the party. She represents economically right and socially right as well. She's made a statement of intent for the rest of her premiership in her Chancellor's mini-budget on Friday, and that is that she's going to be a very right-wing Prime Minister. And there were people in the centre of the party that have sort of come out and spoken out against that. Even, Michael Gove recently was one of the chief opponents to this bankers' bonuses cap being lifted. So, you're seeing quite senior politicians in the Conservative Party speaking out against Liz Truss. And there were indications that if she'd gone ahead with the 45% tax thing that she rode back on, which we alluded to at the beginning and may speak about later, that there would have been huge rebellions on the Tory backbenches. So the fact that it's been pulled should be seen as an indication that Liz Truss had sort of lost faith that she'd be able to get that through the Commons, which is remarkable considering the Conservatives' majority at the minute. They've got a majority, I think, in the 50s, 60s, which is a big majority, and the fact that they feel the need to withdraw economic policy because they think that they could lose a vote. That is very much a signalling that the Tory party is not behind her economically. Yeah. Governments don't pull economic legislation, especially those. I know that this isn't technically a budget. It's a mini budget, but as we said last time, it's effectively a budget. For them to pull something that significant indicates that she has lost support on the backbenches. Yeah. So that is quite serious. So no, she hasn't united the party. She represents a small right-wing faction of the party, and we're already seeing the centre of the party take action against that. And that's best viewed by her massive U-turn today.
Yeah, I think as we said previously, the most success she's had in this is uniting the party against her.
I think
there's all kinds of groupings coming together that might not normally see eye to eye, but kind of agreeing that these are not the policies they want to pursue. So yeah, we'll see how successful that ends up being. It might end up being that these kind of ideologies and these theories end up proving to be successful. They've not got off to a great start, but certainly her and her gaggle of fellow believers have for a long time believed in this kind of ideology, and they'll be hoping that they can turn this around and convince people.
Is that the official phraseology from TLDR from now on, that Liz Truss supporters are the gaggle of faithful believers?
I like that.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, I like that. The final one then, rather than making the party more united, it's uniting the union. How would you say that one's going?
Well, not as tragically badly as uniting the party. The United Kingdom is still together.
It's a low bar.
Well, yeah. The only sort of movement I've seen on this was some suggestion that Liz Truss and her government made that Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, should follow the UK's economic policy from the mini-budget. And Nicola Sturgeon hit back with quite a sarcastic comment about the fact that they're not going to be pursuing that. You wouldn't ever expect, the SNP to get on with the Conservatives. They stand for a completely opposed things on basically everything, social, economic, and policies on the union itself. So they don't get on, but you kind of expect that. You wouldn't expect them to get on. But outside of that, no, there's been, again, no movement. There's been basically, all of these can sort of be summed up by the fact that Truss seems to be focusing heavily on the economy at the minute and hasn't really focused on anything else. Perhaps she will in the next few weeks, but the fallout from her mini-budget has been massive, and she's still dealing with that. And the next sort of statement that they're going to make on this is in November, which is to, try and sort of alleviate some of the concerns from the mini-budget. But until then, I would expect this to sort of rattle on. Like, there's huge opposition to that, which means that the government sort of need to respond to that and needs to try and quell some of the opposition to this, both from individuals and from the market itself. So they're hugely focused on the economy, and so this is why we're not seeing too much movement on things like the union, on doctors, strike action. So I think that they're sort of one mind at the minute. One focus is cost of living and economics. So, no, not a huge amount of movement on the union, as with a lot of other factors at the minute.
Okay, so generously we'll call that a mixed bag, I think. It's too soon to tell on a number of them. There's some that are definitely going badly, and a couple, at least at the start, that were delivering on policies, even if those policies ended up being less successful and less popular than she might be hoping. Either way, though, we'll keep an eye on this list as the next kind of 70 days progress, as we get closer to Christmas and closer to the 100-day mark, and we'll see how she's doing. But for the moment, it seems like a bit of a mixture. Okay, so now we've talked through the 9 core policies and promises that Truss has made. We are joined by Zach Michaelis, TLDR's editor-in-chief, and the three of us are now going to be talking about recent polling and recent developments, which might change the state of things somewhat. Welcome, Zach. How are you doing?
Yeah, very good. A little bit ill, so I apologise for any
Everyone's
sniffles.
ill.
I know, it's that time of year.
It's the illest podcast. It's superb.
This joke is terrible.
Okay, so as we mentioned at the beginning, or as we mentioned throughout really as well, but there's been some changes when it comes to tax. That was one of Truss's core policies. And not only has that kind of impacted that one of the 9, but it felt like as we were running through, it kind of impacted all of the others. It's changed the attitude towards her premiership, her party, her government, whatever. Everything has kind of shifted on the back of this mini budget. So I wanted to kind of hear both of your thoughts on how it's going so far. Obviously, we saw the market's immediate reaction last week, and we discussed that in videos and in last week's podcast. But also towards the end of the week, we saw some updated polling, which painted a pretty negative picture. So a week and a bit on, how do we think it's playing out, and what do we think kind of the more long-term consequences will be of this?
Okay, yeah. So I think ultimately, it shouldn't be too controversial to say that I don't think it's going particularly well. I think, as we sort of discussed earlier, she has basically united the Conservative Party basically against her. She represents quite a ideological right wing of the party who she is representing, but she seems to have signalled her intent quite early on that she's going to be a prime minister very much for them and not the wider Conservative Party. She's moved very quickly with some very right wing conservative sort of economic policy, and she did them all very quickly within a matter of days. Some other prime ministers might have waited a bit longer to do this, and the backlash to that's been sort of immense. There's been reports of no confidence letters going in. There's been reports today that she might have actually lost a vote in the Commons had she decided to press ahead with a 45% reduction in tax, or getting rid of the 45% tax threshold. There were reports that she could have lost that in November, when this was expected to go to a vote in the Commons. As we mentioned earlier on this very podcast, it's not a good indication that they had to drop economic policy this early on and U-turn on it so quickly. I mean, it's a very, very quick, very big, very humiliating U-turn. It's not going very well. But then again, we did know quite early on that she would represent the right wing of the Conservative Party. I don't think people are too surprised that she's representing that faction, that she's going for the economic policy that she is. I think it's just the scale and the speed at which she's done it has taken people, and especially the markets, by surprise.
Zach, do you agree? What do you make of kind of the reaction and also the U-turn on the 45%?
Yeah, obviously, I agree with Ben's sort of broad sentiment that things aren't going well for her. It's not a hot take. You can't really say things are going well for you when you're 30 points behind.
Yeah.
The only two sort of caveats I would add is one, that coalition that Ben was referring to, the fact that her support base is from the right wing of the party. I think that actually, in more bad news for Truss, that support base is perhaps not as solid as she might imagine. I think that while obviously they agree with her sort of right-wing economic policies, she's also signalled her intention to do some more sort of controversial supply side reform. So like loosening immigration law is a big one. I mean, obviously she's U-turned on that 45p tax cut. And I think both of those will probably strain the relations with that right wing of the party. And that means that really Truss has no solid base of support in the parliamentary party, which is pretty bad news for her. And I think you see that in just the way that the Conservative MPs have reacted to her recent kerfuffles. You know, the fact that she can't really get anyone out on the media to defend her, and the fact that actually there's been so much sort of explicit disdain from other Tory MPs about the way things are going. You know, the fact that we're hearing about no confidence letters already, that sort of thing. The other thing I would say is that I think in Truss's mind, in Kwarteng's mind, the idea was to get the unpopular stuff out of the way, and then when the election happens in 2 years' time, no growth will have been stimulated and they'll be popular again. I've got to say that I think in the medium term, at least, that looks very unlikely. I actually they'll get even less popular because, well, for two reasons. First is that both Truss and various cabinet members have signalled that their way of quote unquote balancing the books in the near future to placate the markets is going to involve spending cuts. Sort of, I think the best way of describing them is sort of Osborne style austerity 2.0. And that wasn't popular the first time round. It's not going to be popular this time around. So I think, you know, that doesn't bode well for the medium term. And looking forwards a little bit, I think the interesting thing about the U-turn on the 45p tax cut is it's gone to show that whatever Truss says, she's not actually willing to be that unpopular. And the problem that she has now is that she is a politician with unpopular policy positions, but not that much political capital. So I can't see her getting through, you know, all the things that she wants to do to boost growth, all those controversial supply side reforms like immigration reform, housing reform, tax reform. I can't see her getting those through the Commons, given that she's shown herself to be sensitive to political pressure, which means that what we're likely looking at the next 2 years is someone just getting all the, you know, unpopular little bits through and none of the possibly growth stimulating big bits. So I just can't see things going particularly well for her from here on in.
I think it's also just worth pointing out as well that even aside from her policy positions, her communication has just been awful. It's been truly, truly abysmal. Her interviews last week, her 8 successive 5-minute interviews on local radio was you know, resoundingly terrible in terms of her the way that she presented herself, the fact that she couldn't really offer a defence of her own policies. Just the decision to even go on there was you know, a bit bizarre, to be quite honest. She just hasn't really, you know, the policies themselves seem unpopular, but she just hasn't helped herself by not explaining them or explaining the logic behind them. As Zach sort of said there, she couldn't really get any ministers out on the airwaves to defend them. You know, she almost has added insult to injury by choosing bad policies and then not explaining them and then not defending them or anything like that. So it sort of indicated that it's something that we kind of already knew from the leadership election, which is she's not great at communication strategy or even just sort of like being an effective communicator and a sort of personally, not just her government, but her personally. She isn't really that good at communicating. So I think that sort of reaffirmed that from what we knew from the leadership election. So yeah, she's going to have a difficult couple of years if she is intending to pursue policies that may be unpopular among the wider public, because that, coupled with her not being able to explain them well, isn't really a recipe for a particularly good Conservative showing in the 24 election.
So talking about what people think, as I mentioned earlier, we got some polling end of last week that we discussed last time we recorded this, and it didn't record. It was fresh news then. Now it's a little bit less exciting. But the news out at the end of last week was that Labour picked up a significant lead, over 30 points in some polling, general consensus landing kind of low 20s, but a significant lead for Labour. Obviously, caveats apply. It's one poll or a series of polls taken at the same time, particularly good time for Labour, and we're still quite a long way away from an actual election. But do you think that polling and that reaction will shape both Tory MPs' response to this and also kind of the Truss government's response? Could that polling have anything to do with the kind of U-turns we're seeing? And do you expect it to have a bigger impact going forward?
Yeah, I mean, yes. Obviously, I think every MP knows that if those polls are anywhere close to truth, and if those results are translated onto a general election, they're all losing their seats. Every Tory MP really is losing a seat there, and they'll be bricking it. I mean, that's the prospect of. Sorry, my cat has just jumped up. Go away. There'll be, yeah, there's the prospect of losing their jobs, that they're not going to be happy about it. If I was Truss, I would also be perhaps even, well, there's more reason to worry just in the headline figures. The first thing is that in previous polls, when Labour have demonstrated a steady lead, often it's been because 2019 Tory voters are saying they don't know if they would vote at a general election. It's not that they're moving to Labour, it's more just that there's a sort of, apathy amongst Tory voters. The most recent polling does suggest that actually people are actively moving to Labour now, 2019 Tory voters included. And I think you see, a large part of that is that Starmer has definitely grown in confidence and he's found a knack for putting out popular policies. So I think, again, we talked about this a little bit in that podcast, didn't record, but I think this starts with the windfall tax, which he forced Sunak and Johnson to U-turn on. And you see it more recently with his vague energy nationalisation plan, to get this great British energy company nationalising renewables, that sort of thing. And also the policy announcement made at Labour conference that they were going to nationalise rail, which is something that's very, very popular in the wider public. I think it's about 70% support, maybe a bit higher, but especially popular in red wall seats. So good strategic move by Labour there. And then the final thing I'd say on the polling is that, again, obviously very good headline figures for Labour, but on the underlying numbers, Labour also doing very, very well. So traditionally, there are two things that are very good predictors of your success in the general election, apart from the headline number, and that is whether or not the public think you're competent with the economy, and whether or not the public think that you'd be the better prime minister. And while the Conservatives were behind when Truss first came in, they did still have narrow leads in best PM and competence with the economy. That is no longer true. Truss is, for obvious reasons, considered just wildly incompetent with the economy. I mean, the figures are truly astounding. It's gone from sort of like 40% of people think that they would be better with the economy to like 10. And Truss herself is seen as a terrible prime minister, which again, I think Ben touched on it earlier. Her communication skills are very key to that. That's obviously the way you present to the public. And if you're not communicating, you don't pass that sort of sniff test with the wider general public. So I just think that as well as it being bad headline numbers, truly appalling headline numbers in some cases, that YouGov poll you mentioned, the fact that Labour have a 33-point lead there is just astounding. She should also be worried about by the underlying trends and Labour's new knack for attracting voters.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to that, really. The fact that Liz, Truss and her government are behind on best prime minister and the economy, and the fact that you've got the YouGov poll are not good signs for the Conservatives. It's also worth pointing out that the YouGov poll isn't just in isolation. I know you mentioned some other polls as well, but on the same day that was released, we also had a Servation, Delta poll and Retfield Wilson poll, all released with the time the poll was taken basically on the same day. And an average of the four polls was a 22.5 point lead for Labour. So on average, you'd sort of expect Labour to be, I don't know, maybe between 5 and 10 points ahead. Recently, we've seen them maybe 12 points ahead, which has been seen as quite astoundingly good for Labour. But on average, a 22.5 point lead. Again, this is one snapshot. It's better to look at overall trends and look at polls of polls, which we haven't really had yet because it's not been enough time. So, all of this should be taken with a pinch of salt because it is such a short time frame that we're looking at. But as at least an indication of how she's doing right now, it's really, really not good. Labour are doing exceptionally well at the minute. And as Zach said, the Tories should be worried about this because it's not necessarily just against the Conservatives this time. It's because voters are starting to identify with policy positions. I know that one of the big sort of criticisms of Keir Starmer over the last year, at least within sort of Labour circles, is that he's quite light on policy, that nobody really knows what Starmer stands for. He was sort of had some difficulty in lockdown because Labour were broadly in support of the lockdown policy, but they're now starting to come into their own because, they've had their conference, they've got policies that they stand by, and Starmer's, agreeing to them. So this should be worrying to the Conservatives because they're not only behind, but Labour do have a policy platform. And as Zach said, the public are sort of identifying with some of the policies. So, Starmer's starting to sort of get into the groove of being a leader. I know that we're 2 years out from the election, but things really aren't looking good for the Conservatives. So, Liz Truss really needs to, she needs to change up what she's doing at the minute if she wants a chance of being Prime Minister past 2024.
And obviously some of that boost for Starmer and part of his increased credibility and his kind of like ability to lead policies has been led out of Labour Party conference last week. We are now in the midst of Conservative Party conference. Do you think we're going to see any change there, or do you think Truss has less of a chance to change the narrative, just given the fact that she's kind of set such a precedent going in?
Well, I think there's a chance. She could. you know, maybe focus attention on some other policies if key policies are announced. But ultimately, it's just a lot that she has to change. It seems almost insurmountable from one conference to be able to really change the sort of narrative building about Truss, that she's not to be trusted with the economy, that she's not a particularly good prime minister, that she's a bad communicator. There'd have to be something truly monumental to sort of change the media's perception within sort of one conference. So it might be like the start. She might be able to sort of start that ball rolling on increasing Conservative polling, but yeah, it would be a start at best. And given that it's only been a few days, I doubt it.
And Zach, on that, obviously reflecting on both her odds at conference and going forward, are there any things you would give as advice to Truss if you were in the position? Are there any things that she's obviously messing up that you think could be easily fixed to help swing the polls? Or is it not as clear cut as that, do you think?
Yeah, this is when I disclose my second job as Liz Truss's PR guru.
You shouldn't admit to that if it were true.
Yeah, no, that is definitely a joke. On the conference stuff, I can't really see conference going well for her. I think for two reasons. First, if she does make any policy changes, it's almost definitely going to be a downstream consequence from pressure from MPs at conference. So you know, this is what happened with the 45p tax cut U-turn. It was because Michael Gove went to an event and started saying, you know, we can't support this tax cut. And then a load of MPs piggybacked on that, and you know, it just looked weak from Truss's position. So if she does U-turn on any of her currently unpopular policies, it will look weak because it will be as a response to pressure from other Conservative MPs. And I think the other reason it's just going to go badly is at these sort of Tory conferences that there are a whole load of events that are run by those like right-wing think tanks, you know, sort of IEA, that sort of bunch. And you're just going to get clips. I can see it coming of various government ministers sitting in those think tanks, you know, saying sort of disagreeable right-wing stuff about how much they love the new low tax agenda and how much they hate regulation and all those sort of things that play well with certain bits of the Tory base and certain factions within Truss's government, but just don't play well with the wider public. I don't know if you saw that, but there was a good example of this quite recently, which I think Chris Phillips, I think that's what his name is. He's one of the Treasury guys at the moment. He was at a fringe event, I think, again, run by a right-wing think tank, and he suggested as a policy that any business under 500 people shouldn't be subject to business regulations, which is just it's a crazy idea. I can't wait to run my 499 child tin mine in Leicestershire or wherever it is. But it's clearly a nuts policy, and it's the sort of thing that only gets applause at lunatic right-wing fringe events. And you can see how more of that sort of stuff shared on Twitter is just going to go down very badly for her. I think in the medium term, I can't really see much hope for Truss. I do think her best bet actually is to follow through with her current plan of going for those controversial but potentially growth stimulating supply side policies, which is supposed to announce in November, but I think she'll have to announce them earlier to sort of ease some of the political pressure. And because I just think at the moment that she doesn't have the political space to do a whole new project. And her current project, if she only goes half-heartedly with it and doesn't end up with the high growth rates, it's just going to be deeply, deeply unpopular. So I think she'll have to try and push through some of those controversial things like housing reform, immigration reform are two very good examples. Housing reform is hated by Southern Tories because those of them in leafy green shires, their constituents get very worried about the idea of the green belt being trampled upon and big developments near their little villages. And Boris Johnson wanted to reform that as well, but he couldn't get it through in the end. And it's a similar thing with immigration reform. Obviously, not very popular actually with the Tory base. They don't like high immigration, but it is growth stimulating. The simple reason that more people usually means more growth, more economic activity. So I think her best bet actually is to try and go through with some of those, and then hopefully in 2 years' time she can go, look, we have sorted some stuff out. I know you didn't like it at the time, but all of a sudden we have a growth rate, you know, a trend growth rate of 2.5%, which is a stated target. You know, we're maybe the second, third fastest growing economy in the G7. I think it's very, very unlikely. I think it's both politically difficult because, you know, politically stronger figures like Boris Johnson have tried this before and they failed. So I can't really see Liz Truss getting it through, especially given she has no mandate whatsoever. But it's also logistically difficult. I mean, I'm talking in broad strokes here about housing reform and immigration reform, but obviously these are complicated policy areas, and sorting out something like housing, which has sort of, it's essentially sort of like a massive policy backlog of its own. You know, it's a really complicated policy area, and there's been so many fuck ups over so many governments. Sorting that out is not an easy task, and it requires a very competent government and maybe more time than Truss has. It's a similar thing with immigration. So I think it's a real uphill battle from here for her. But yeah, I think that's the main takeaway. It doesn't look good for her. I can't really see a way out per se. I just think charge head first, hope for the best, and see what happens.
Finally then, we asked our audience last week how much longer they thought Truss had, how much faith they had in her continued tenure in number 10. We asked them how long they expected Liz Truss to remain Prime Minister for, and we gave them the options of less than 100 days, less than a year, until the next election, or beyond the next election. At this point, 67,000 people have voted. Those are obviously 67,000 audience members for TLDR, so not necessarily the most representative sample size, probably significantly younger than the average voter. But regardless, the results are as follows. 45% of people think that she'll last less than 100 days. 25% of people think she'll last less than a year. 28% think she'll last up until the next election but would be kicked out at that stage. And 2% think she'll last beyond the next election. Ben, which of those groups do you side with? Which of those categories seems the most likely to you? And bear in mind, we will be clipping this and using this against you in the future.
Well, I think I'm with the 28% there that says that they reckon she'll last until the next election, but no longer than that. I think that the Conservative Party know that sort of getting rid of her at this point doesn't look particularly good on them. I know that she's quite behind in polling, but the Conservatives are generally, at normal times, seen as the more safe and stable pair of hands. I know that she's undermining that slightly, but if they keep changing their leaders every few months, it makes the situation even worse, and it's not ideal. I think she's probably also going to be secure from a vote of no confidence for about a year anyway, which should give her some time to at least get rid of to move away from the complete chaos that we're in at the minute, and hopefully just sort of like reaffirm herself as Prime Minister. I don't think she's going to be particularly popular, but I think by then, talk about no confidence and things like that may have subsided. So I think it's likely that she'll last until the next election, but I don't think she's going to improve the polling too much, and I think they're going to be pretty wiped out in 24. And if they are, I think they're going to choose a new leader then.
Zach, do you agree she's going to make it the next election, do you think?
Yeah, really, really boringly, I think I probably do agree with Ben. I think I probably placed, I think it's more likely than Ben thinks it is that she'll be gone very soon. I know that Ben mentioned that in normal times the Tories have a reputation for being the more stable of the two parties, and for not doing silly things like kicking out leaders after a month. But I think with the sort of constant churn of Tory MPs, they've kicked a lot out of a lot of MPs, and they've had a whole lot new lot come in. The Tory MPs have sort of lost that institutional memory for stability, and at least in recent history, it does look like Tory MPs are very reactive when it comes to stuff like bad polling. I mean, you see that sort of like flow every time Johnson got a single bad poll. You get a couple more letters going in, a bit more chaos. And I think I can at least imagine a situation where you get a couple more weeks of some 30-plus Labour leads, and that's just enough for a whole load of sort of like 2017, 2019 Tory MPs who haven't been in the job very long and they're pretty worried about losing their seats. So I think I do still agree with Ben though. I think the most likely thing is that she stumbles her way through to 2024 and then gets hammered. But I think the Tory party have proven themselves more fickle than they used to be, and I could see them getting rid of Truss soon.
I agree with both of you. I think I do see where Zach's coming from though. I think especially because they could relatively easily, I suppose, swap in for someone like Rishi Sunak, who has a fairly plausible line of saying, well, I never really liked this. I said it would be a disaster. Here's me during the campaign saying it. And sure, it would look bad on the party, but from the leadership perspective and from the who's the better Prime Minister perspective, he at least has a record economically and is able to say, hey, I never supported this. It's a fresh start yet again. And I don't think there's enough time to reset fully from that. I think it would still lead to a loss for them. And whether they want to let another potential leader lose or whether they'd rather save him for post-24, I don't know. But you can see why they might think, well, this isn't going to work, so let's throw something new at it. But I agree. That's not likely. I just can see why they might be tempted to in that circumstance.
I think Zach is right in characterising my views as sort of like thinking that they're not going that the Tory party is sort of more stable than probably Zach thinks it is. But I still do think that they took a long time to get rid of Johnson, and he won the no confidence vote. It took them months and months of Partygate scandals and sex scandals and God knows what else before they even triggered enough votes, letters of no confidence to have the vote of no confidence, which he did subsequently win. It was only because of a flurry of resignations following the Chris Pincher scandal that we finally broke down. I do agree, though, that I do think that they're probably more fickle now, and they probably are more happy to get rid of a leader. But I think Zach is right that we just disagree on the relative likelihood of that happening, and I think it's probably lower than Zach probably thinks it is.
Okay, we will see who's right. We will have the result at some point in the future. She will eventually leave office. Who knows? It might be after multiple consecutive successful election wins. I feel like that's unlikely, but 2% of people think she's going to win in 24, so who knows? But we'll have the result at some point. We'll circle back to this. We will use our answers against us. But we all agreed, so it's not going to be the most interesting gotcha moment. But we'll see. Either way, clearly a difficult couple of weeks for Truss. I mean, it's been a difficult first month, all in all. Some successes against her kind of 9 original promises. But all in all, some pretty major distractions from her core agenda and some pretty big disasters. So we'll see if the next 70 or so days is any more successful. But for the moment, I think we're right naming the podcast what we did, because Truss certainly has some issues.
Yes.
That's the end.
Yes.